Good evening, and thanks for coming to the second event in the Center for Excellence in Humanities, in the Arts and Humanities event. This is our programming series focusing on arts and humanities and the environment. My name is Cheryl St. Germain. I'm the director of the center. We have a wonderful evening for you tonight. I am incredibly excited to have two guests, Scott Slovic, who's come to us from the University of Nevada, Reno, and Peggy Barlett from Emory University, and a number of very distinguished members of our own faculty from various disciplines. We have a panelist from the art and design area, we have someone from anthropology, we have a historian, we have a scientist, and we have a philosopher, and we have a literary critic. So it's really exciting for me to have all of these different disciplines here together talking about a single subject. And the subject tonight is what's nature worth? And I'll say just a couple words about what we mean by nature. This is a subject that could take up several semesters worth of talk, but for our purposes, I think we mean nature to be the non-human world. We, of course, are part of nature. One could argue that everything is nature, but we want to talk about how our various disciplines respond to the non-human world and what our relationship is to that world. Scott posed a number of questions to the panelists, and we will address some of those questions and also range maybe far and wide from those questions. I'm from New Orleans, and I'm a great believer in improvisation. So we're gonna have some riffs off of each other, and I think it's gonna be very exciting. I will say a few words about each panelist, ending with Scott Slovic, and then Scott will make some remarks about 20 minutes, and I've asked the panelists to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, after which we will take questions from the audience. There's a mic there, and if you would like to pose a question, simply walk up to the mic. Afterwards, we'll have a book signing, and also Steve Hernstadt, who is one of our panelists, an artist. You'll see his work around on these easels. Will be selling cards in the back, prints that he'll be sitting next to the people signing books. We'll also have a little reception. I want to thank the English department, Philosophy and Religious Studies, and lectures for co-sponsoring this event. Fred Kirschenmann, who is the second person sitting up here, is the director of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Fred is also a professor of religion and philosophy. At the time of his appointment in 2000, he managed a 3,500-acre certified organic family farm in south central North Dakota. He told me he still manages this farm, only he does it via cell phone. He helped found Farm Verified Organic Inc., a private certification agency, and the Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society. He earned degrees from Yankton College in South Dakota, Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He's the author of numerous articles and book chapters dealing with ethics and agriculture, and I read on his website that he said that his training in philosophy teaches him to ask the questions beyond the questions, and I hope that that's something we're going to do tonight. Next to Fred is Steve Hernstadt, who is an artist. He has obtained his MFA in Studio Art and Art History from the School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa. He is an associate professor in integrated studio biological pre-medical illustration in the Department of Art and Design. He has published numerous pieces, the latest of which I believe is Introduction to Visual Literacy, which is a 640-plus page interactive World Wide Web publication, which he co-authored with C. Arthur Croyle and Dennis Drake. He has had numerous one-person exhibits as well as group exhibits throughout the state and the nation. Next to Steve is Ramesh Kanwar, who is the department chair of the Agricultural and Biosystem Engineering Department at Iowa State. He was director of the Iowa Water Resources Research Institute, and until 2001, he's worked as a consultant for the World Bank, European Commission, Global Environment Facility, the United Nations Development Program, the United States Agency for International Development, and NATO. He's an honorary professor at both Beijing Agricultural University in China and Tashkent Institute of Irrigation and Agricultural Mechanization in Uzbekistan. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences in India, and he has authored more than 400 publications. Next to Ramesh is Joseph Taylor III. I will call him Jay from now on. He has his PhD from the University of Washington in history. And currently, Jay is an associate professor in the history department, but unfortunately for us, he has just accepted another position at Simon Fraser University, and beginning in the spring, he will be the Canada Research Chair in History and Geography at Simon Fraser University. This is a position that comes with I understand, a well-endowed lab, and we wish Jay lots of luck, but we certainly will miss him. His work has won numerous awards. Just recently, he's returned from North Carolina at the National Humanities Center, where he was a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellow in Environmental Studies. His book, Making Salmon, An Environmental History of the Northwest Fishing Crisis, won several awards. The Library Journal listed it as one of the 10 best books in technology and science, and the American Society for Environmental History awarded it the prize for best book in 1999. His new work is focusing on rock climbing and the modern environmental culture. Next to Jay is Peggy Barlett, who is visiting us from Emory, where she is in the anthropology department. Peggy will also be offering a workshop tomorrow night at 7 o'clock back in the Union on sustainable development and campus greening, specifically as it applies to Iowa State. Peggy lives in Atlanta, and she says that she's watched Atlanta become the poster child for sprawl, and that she has become aware of environmental and social harms of modern industrial society, partly because of that witness. She has done a great deal of activist work in Atlanta at Emory in terms of greening that college, including several new, helping to establish several new communities of practice, a faculty green lunch, an ad hoc committee for environmental stewardship, and many other activities. She has several books out, 2 of which, American Dreams, Rural Realities, Family Farms in Crisis, and Agricultural Choice and Change, Decision Making in a Costa Rican Community. Finally, I'll say a few words about Scott Slovic, our host, basically, for this panel. Scott is a native Midwesterner. He was born in Chicago, but he grew up in Eugene, Oregon. He earned his bachelor's in English at Stanford and his MA and PhD in English and American Studies at Brown. Scott's been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Bonn in Germany and at the University of Tokyo in Japan, and he served as a visiting professor at Rice University and at the University of Queensland in Australia. Since 1995, he's been Professor of Literature and Environment and Director of the Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities at the University of Nevada, Reno. He currently chairs the graduate program in Literature and Environment at UNR, which is the major program in the field as well. He served as the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment from 1992 to 95, and since 95 he's edited Asley's journal, IO, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, which is the central scholarly journal in this field. Since 1997, he's edited 2 book series in Milkweed Editions' Credo series and in the University of Nevada Press's Environmental Arts and Humanities series. His scholarly interests include American, British, German, Japanese, and Australian environmental literature. He just returned a few days ago, really, from the Watermark International Nature Writers Muster in Australia, where he gave several lectures and helped to establish the Australian-New Zealand branch of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. He's published more than 60 articles on environmental literature, has authored, edited, or co-edited 9 books, starting with Seeking Awareness, American Nature Writing, and including Getting Over the Color Green, both of which are available at the book table. He has 3 new co-edited books due out next year, and his talk tonight will offer a brief introduction to one of these, titled What's Nature Worth? Narrative Expressions of Environmental Values. After all of that, I feel like I should send you home. That's probably the longest introduction I've ever done in my life, but it's well worth it. Please welcome Scott Slovic.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. Is this microphone working? Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah, you can hear me on the sides also? Thank you. Cheryl, could you do me a favor and help me keep track of time? Okay, I have my watch off here, but I really want to be careful not to go over time. Okay, perhaps you could let me know when 10 minutes have passed and again at 18, because I'm going to try to speak for 20 minutes. Okay? So I'd like to thank Cheryl St. Germain and her colleagues at the English Department and the Center for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities. And I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for participating in this forum. I feel very honored to be here. And thanks to all of you for showing up to listen to us talk and participate in our discussion afterwards, whether you're here voluntarily or under duress. Thank you. I think of these remarks under the rubric of the following title: What's Nature Worth? Attention, Sensation, and Valuation Through Environmental Literature. I'm sorry, Ms. Williams, there's something about your voice I cannot hear. There's something about your voice I cannot hear. This was Utah Congressman Jim Hansen speaking to nature writer Terry Tempest Williams after she presented her essay Bloodlines as a testimonial statement during a public hearing in southern Utah regarding wilderness preservation in that part of the state back in 1995. The idea that there are certain kinds of voices, certain modes of discourse that were unheard and perhaps unhearable in public discussions of environmental values and policy is what inspired Canadian anthropologist Terry Satterfield and me to undertake the project that's called What's Nature Worth? Narrative Expressions of Environmental Values 7 years ago. A book that has evolved from this research will appear from the University of Utah Press in the spring. Sorry, this microphone seems a little funny. Okay, I'd like to backtrack a little bit and discuss what I consider to be two of the central facets of the field that we often refer to as environmental literature. First of all, how this writing guides us to pay deeper attention to our physical senses and enables us to appreciate our own embeddedness in the world. And also, secondly, how this writing enables us to develop, clarify, and articulate our feelings about the world's meaning, its value. So to engage with our senses and realize our presence in the world, our visceral, fundamental connectedness to other things in the world, other parts of nature, and secondly, to develop our sense of values and to articulate these values. These I view as crucial parts of the project that we call nature writing. So I posed several questions, fairly basic, broad questions to the other panelists earlier in the summer. And I don't know that I really groped for the questions behind the questions, but I tried to ask some fairly broad kinds of things that I wanted to think about with my colleagues from various other disciplines. And I tried to reconstruct those a little bit this afternoon, but I'm not sure I remembered exactly what I had initially asked. So some of the things that I'll broach in this discussion are: where do our environmental values come from, our sense of nature's meaning or its importance? How are these values formed? What can different academic disciplines teach us about nature's value? And what kind of education do we need in order to live sustainable lives in the world? I often find myself referring to Indiana writer Scott Russell Sanders' 1987 essay, Speaking a Word for Nature, which was published in his book, Secrets of the Universe. I refer to this as a key articulation of what literature needs to do if it's to help us appreciate the ecological implications of our presence on the planet. In this essay, he critiques the tendency in popular contemporary American writing, especially fiction, to ignore non-human nature. He calls such writing pathological for its avoidance of reality, its neglect of questions and issues crucial to the current and long-time survival of our species. This is what Sanders writes. However accurately it reflects the surface of our times, Literature that never looks beyond the human realm is profoundly false and therefore pathological. No matter how urban our experience, no matter how oblivious we may be toward nature, we are nonetheless animals, two-legged sacks of meat and blood and bone, dependent on the whole living planet for our survival. Our outbreathings still flow through the pores of trees. Our food still grows in dirt. Our bodies decay. Of course, we all nod our heads in agreement. The gospel of ecology has become an intellectual commonplace, but it is not yet an emotional one. For most of us, most of the time, nature appears framed in a window or a video screen or inside the borders of a photograph. We do not feel the organic web passing through our guts as it truly does. While our theories of nature have become wiser, our experience of nature has become shallower. Thus, any writer who sees the world in ecological perspective faces a hard problem. How, despite the perfection of our technological boxes, to make us feel the ache and tug of that organic web passing through us, how to situate the lives of characters, and therefore of readers, in nature, end quote. So the great difficulty faced by writers who tend to be attuned to their personal experience of the world and the implications of that experience is to communicate their ideas to a readership that first may be more interested in watching television or film than in reading, and second, a readership that has little direct experience of the non-human world. I live in a fairly typical suburban neighborhood in Reno, Nevada, where large houses cover entire lots, and the most prominent features of many homes are the multiple garages for cars, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 garages per house. I seldom see my neighbors. They drive home from work, electronically open their garages, and close the garage doors by remote control after they drive in. This I view as a kind of metaphor for how they live their entire lives, how many of us do in this contemporary American society, more or less enclosed within human constructions. Compelling such people to think of the ecological implications of their lives is an uphill challenge, but it's a challenge that many contemporary writers and artists nonetheless feel compelled to take on. So I started thinking recently about what the role of literature may be in stimulating us to pay more attention to our senses. And the phrase that I found myself developing is that this is not nature writing or environmental literature exactly, but it's the literature of sensory ecology. It's a literature that inspires readers and listeners to pay more attention to their physical senses. It somehow prods us, exhorts us to remember our senses, and then often enacts or demonstrates how to use our senses. This may seem trivial and irrelevant, because all of us basically know that we have certain fundamental ways of sensing the physical world, but we tend to live lifestyles that are increasingly deprived of sensation, or if we do notice our sensations, we don't know what to make of them. We don't know how to derive meaning from the world as a result of these. So I've started referring to this literature of sensory ecology as a way, with my literary colleagues, of suggesting that environmental literature, the literature of sensory ecology, is not just a toy, but it's something that is contributing meaningfully to contemporary society. The essayist and poet Diane Ackerman writes in the preface to her book, A Natural History of the Senses, how sense-luscious the world is. How sense-luscious the world is. Many of us actually go through our lives not quite thinking this, not aware of just how fabulously luscious and engaging the world actually is, unaware of how our senses are connecting us moment by moment to the rest of the world. It's the purpose of most, if not all, of the people that we often call environmental writers to do just this, to stimulate us to be cognizant of the fact that the world is sense-luscious. It's constantly stimulating us and interacting with us through our physical senses. There's actually a substantial body of literature specifically about the physical senses. I'm thinking of Australian essayist Eric Rolls's 1990 book, A Celebration of the Senses, or the brand new book, 2003 book, by Japanese-American farmer and nature writer David Masumoto, called 4 Seasons in 5 Senses, Things Worth Savoring. If I had a bit more time, I'd actually read to you a brief passage, a vignette from Alaskan nature writer Richard Nelson's 1989 book, The Island Within, which demonstrates how the narration of a vivid experience, physical experience, leads directly into a contemplation of the broader ethical and ecological implications of that experience. The passage that I had thought I might read before I decided to really abbreviate this talk is a kind of allegory. It's a powerful demonstration of how we need first to feel the world, we need to sense the world, and then to reflect upon these sensations. Actually, on the flight over here, when I was still planning to read this passage, I copied out a page-long narrative from Nelson's book about his encounter with a bald eagle, where he decides to creep closer and closer to the eagle than he had ever been, and actually begin climbing up the tree until he's perched 15 or 20 feet below the eagle, examining every aspect of it and simultaneously being examined by the eagle. Ultimately, it's a kind of demonstration of the reciprocity between the human and the non-human, to not just to grant agency to the non-human world, so that the world has the power to take him in and then make decisions about how it behaves, not just to be an inert object acted upon by the human. The reason I selected this particular passage is that last week, while I was traveling in Australia with Richard Nelson, driving all around Eastern Australia, my son, who's in a 10th grader in high school in Reno, was taking a national standardized test, and he said, you know, we had to do a reading comprehension portion, and we read this excerpt from Richard Nelson's The Island Within, where he encountered an eagle. And it seemed to me a fabulous example of the mainstreaming of this kind of literature. And I wondered whether 10th graders all across the country might be reading this passage and lodging it in their memories and thinking about it. And it seemed like a fabulous way of getting nature writing out to the general public and forcing them to think about the natural world, even though most of them are just thinking about which college they're going to get into. Anyway, that's from The Island Within, and I won't read that whole passage to you. Often, nonfiction has a special force because it is based on actual experiences. It has a kind of journalistic power, a special kick, because the things described more or less have actually happened. But fiction also is a particularly good genre in which to present narratives that are readily perceived, not only as specific stories, but as allegories that mirror our own experience or help us to project ourselves into the stories that others are telling. There's something about the fictional medium that gives us the space to imagine that we are participating in these narratives and kind of constructing our own parallel stories. There are many fine examples of environmental fiction that functions allegorically to demonstrate how engagement with the world through our senses might somehow revitalize us and enable us to live more conscious and meaningful lives. One fine example of this is David James Duncan's 1983 novel, The River Why, about a narrator who's a fishing prodigy who comes to learn that it's important for him not only to know how to catch fish, but to appreciate why he finds it useful and meaningful to have such interactions with fish, with nature. One of my own favorite fictional allegories of sensory engagement with nature is actually James Dickey's 1970 novel, Deliverance. The novel begins by depicting four main characters, modern suburban American men, jaded and alienated by their trivial lives. The narrative, as many of you know, describes their weekend adventure in the backwoods of Georgia as they undertake to float a river one last time before it's dammed and lost forever. The damming of the river itself serves as a powerful metaphor, of course, for the dreadful draining of life energy from the lives of these suburban characters through their daily ennui and alienation. In a fairly brief span of pages, we can see clearly that the novel is about learning to celebrate sensory experience of the world. Here's one of my favorite passages. Just as the character Lewis is driving his car down close to the Coolahuasi River with the narrator Ed in the passenger seat. "Hold on," Lewis said, and tipped the car forward. Rhododendron and laurel bushes closed in on us with a soft, limber rush. A branch of something jumped in the window and stayed, lying across my chest. We had stopped, and I sat with the pressure of the woods against me. When I looked down, I saw that one leaf was shaking with my heart. Just a few pages before, the narrator, Ed, sat in his office at the advertising agency where he worked and felt enervated, almost lifeless, unsure that his heart was even beating. He felt like a ghost. Already in this early passage, after they've begun the river trip, he's starting to attend to the world, to notice things. The description of the leaf leaning against his beating heart is a telling line. The novel as a whole illuminates the pain and the value of living intensely in the world. Acknowledging and fully attending to our senses is not an immediate solution to the frustrations, the ennui and boredom that we feel often in our suburban, mundane, routinized, overly scheduled lives. It's not an immediate solution to the problems of our society. But paying attention to the senses, some would argue, is a necessary first step. The idea that we can begin with personal sensory experience and then quickly build upon such experience in order to develop a better understanding of large-scale ecological processes is well explained in environmental education scholar Mitchell Tomashow's recent book, 2002 book, Bringing the Biosphere Home, Learning to Perceive Global Environmental Change. Tomashow suggests that we can use our senses to explore connections between our specific places in the world and the rest of the planet. He argues that it's crucial, if we're to know what's happening in the world during this time of significant changes, for us to think in terms of relationship, particularly the relationship between our place and other places, our moment in history and other times, past and future. Several of Tomashow's points specifically tie in with the role of literature in helping people to, quote, bring the biosphere home, to understand the big picture of the biosphere, the planet and its atmosphere, by way of close attention to home, where we are at any given moment. Here's his explanation of the methods of his own practice of biospheric perception. Many people don't want to pay attention or worry about big kinds of global change because these seem beyond our perception and these seem to be intractable, immovable forces. And so it's merely frustrating, we think, to try to notice what's going on. That's one reason I think why George W. Bush doesn't want to pay any attention to global warming, because he's worried that he's powerless to do anything about it, and it's very easy to dismiss it and ignore the possibility that it exists, because global warming, he would argue, cannot really be perceived. You know, you walk outdoors, and yes, I know it was 89 degrees yesterday at the end of October in Ames, Iowa, but what does that really mean? Mitch Tomashow says, first, I emphasize the importance of routine experience. In the course of your daily affairs and adventures, you have all the material you need for interpreting global environmental change. Biospheric perception is a practice you can engage in wherever you might be. Second, he says, I emphasize the narrative experience. I probe the stories that emerge from childhood memories, travels, and conversations in conjunction with imaginative forays. Third, I encourage you to carefully observe what you observe, knowing your proclivities and interests, assessing your insights, figuring out your perceptual and ecological strengths and weaknesses, the things you see as well as the gaps, and using good teachers to help you with this. Fourth, biospheric perception is a community practice, something you engage in with other people. It takes lots of folks pointing things out to each other to reap the deepest insights. You don't have to understand everything by yourselves. If you talk to people, as we had this panel together at dinner, and I felt that if we had merely talked about our experiences today and then begun to extrapolate from those experiences based on what we know about the world and the environmental processes of the world, we could have constructed a fairly in-depth and powerful image of the state of the world today as a community talking together. Fifth, he says, Tomashow says, I emphasize the importance of global change science as a means to provide balance and ballast for your observations. The biosphere is not necessarily what you project it to be. It involves processes and patterns that are empirically derived. So any one of us, as lay people or as specialists in non-scientific disciplines, can use our perceptions to notice things about the world, but that's not to say that we should entirely neglect the theories and perceptions of formal empirical science. And then finally, says Tomashow, I wind through a shifting phenomenological and existential passage. By phenomenology, I refer to the great insights that can be derived from one's direct sensory impressions. By existential, I convey the impression that we are investigating ideas and concepts we can never fully understand. So this sense of humility, this desire to understand how the world works and what our relation to the world is, with the caveat that we can't quite ever fathom exactly what's going on, that some things will always be mysterious to us, seems to be an important element in Tomašov's perspective, and it's certainly something that one often finds in environmental literature, an idea that there's a limited ability to actually understand the subtleties and the vast processes of the world. I've said a few things now about paying attention to the world, briefly touched on the idea that environmental writing expresses authors' own physical encounters with the world and their ideas about these encounters. One of the crucial questions about literary accounts of such experiences and ideas is how they will affect readers, and further, how such writing might eventually have an impact on environmental laws and policies, and on the daily behavior, even the conscious and unconscious worldviews of other members of society. Remember the passage with which I began this discussion, the oft-quoted statement by Utah Congressman Jim Hansen. It may someday be printed on his tombstone. "I'm sorry, Ms. Williams, but there's something about your voice I cannot hear." Comfortable with and accustomed to the discourse of law and economics, but less so with the language of story, at least in a public policy context, Hansen could not pick up the usable, values-related aspects of Williams' narrative. They somehow eluded his hearing, his comprehension. I'm going to skip actually reading the opening paragraphs of Williams' short essay, Bloodlines, because I feel like if I'm presenting any of it, I should read the whole thing, and I don't want to take the time to do that necessarily. But if you look for the book Bloodline, or the book Testimony, edited by Stephen Trimble and Terry Tempest Williams, published in 1996 by Milkweed Editions, you can get a copy of that essay, Bloodlines, and it will also appear in the book What's Nature Worth? As I mentioned earlier, I've just completed this 7-year project with Terry Satterfield from the University of British Columbia, sponsored by the Environmental Values Program at the American National Science Foundation, for which we conducted in-depth interviews with a dozen distinguished American environmental writers, ranging from Native American authors such as Simon Ortiz and Ophelia Zepeda, to Terry Tempest Williams herself, and then a variety of other writers. It was our goal, specifically, to use these writers as lay ethicists, as people who devote their lives to using language as a way of understanding the value of nature, not as academic specialists in the field called environmental ethics, but as storytellers who work every day to understand the value, the meaning, or the importance of their experiences in the world. We ask them questions about their approaches to writing stories, essays, and poems. We ask them to reflect on how information... Time to stop?
Yeah.
2 minutes, or...
You've gone 25.
Oh, okay, I didn't know what your sign said. Okay, sorry about that. I couldn't read the sign. Sorry about that. So, anyway, this is an effort to just abbreviate a vast study of environmental values and the language of story, to reintroduce story into the discussion and to suggest that it's relevant to the kinds of decisions and public policy evaluations that are being made in various other branches of environmental studies. If there's an opportunity during our following discussion, I'll actually read about a 12-line poem by Ophelia Zepeda to give you an example of this language that we feel is communicating environmental values, but in a rather oblique narrative fashion. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Well, let me follow on that with a couple of simple ideas that I think we all need to wrestle with in our culture. And the first idea is that, which is very deeply ingrained in our culture, which is that we are somehow separate from nature, that we act upon nature, that nature is out there and we are here. And it really, that that notion has really pervaded almost all of our relationships to ourselves, our relationship to nature, our relationship to other human beings. And so it's an interesting question to ask how we got there, how we got to thinking about ourselves that way. And there are, of course, many people that have wrestled with this. David Abram, in a wonderful little book called The Spell of the Sensuous, argues that it really began with written language, that when we had oral cultures, we were much more, saw ourselves as a part of everything else in the world, and we built our stories around the local experiences that we had in the world. And then when we gravitated toward written language, we got more engaged in the abstractions, and so we're no longer engaged, we were engaged in the thoughts about deer rather than engaged with the deer. And he makes a very compelling argument for that. Morris Bierman, in a book which he published back in 1981 called The Reenchantment of the World, argues that a real separation from nature, or this sense that we're somehow separate, goes back to the 17th century and the emergence of the scientific revolution, and in tandem with that, the Industrial Revolution. And the scientific revolution taught us that we indeed need to separate ourselves in order to be objective, in order that our rational minds and analysis of the truth around us can be understood without interference from our passion or other things that would detract us from the pure truth. And the Industrial Revolution taught us that in order to increase our well-being, we need to exploit the natural resources around us to our benefit. And so nature ends up being, as Thomas Berry describes it, a kind of collection of objects rather than a communion of subjects. And of course, if we take anything seriously since Darwin about what the world really is like, with this very complex system of organisms and various kinds of cooperations and competitions, then of course we recognize that it is much more a community of subjects than a collection of objects. But whatever it is that led us to that point, here we are. And so the second kind of question then which emerges is this whole notion of that human as we try to address this and try to heal this, we then come to the conclusion that human activity somehow ends up being bad and evil, and natural activity, or the activity within nature, is good. And I think that's problematic. And even when Wallace Stegner uses this wonderful metaphor about getting over the color green, which Scott used as the title for one of his wonderful anthologies. And I hate lawns because I think there's a lot of things about how we manage nature with lawns which could be a whole lot more creative and interesting. And that's sort of the metaphor that he has in mind when he said we need to get beyond the color green. But in point of fact, as Richard Lewontin and others, geneticists from Harvard and others, have pointed out, is that all organisms modify their environment. In fact, if it weren't for all of the organisms within nature using the bits and pieces of nature that are available to them and modifying those bits and pieces to enable their own existence, we wouldn't have such a thing called as an environment. It is all the activity, all of the organisms in nature modifying the environment that produce these rich set of relationships in which the waste from one species becomes the food for another species, etc. And humans are simply a part of that drama. We modify the environment as well. And so the question, I think, is not bad humans modifying the environment over nature organisms which are somehow pure and clean and don't modify the environment. That's really not the way it works. And the real question then becomes how the modification of the environment affects the whole. And over this 3.5 billion years since living organisms have been a part of this planet, there has emerged this very vibrant and relatively resilient community that enables the whole system to function and the individuals within the system to survive. But as Lewontin reminds us, it's been a very costly process. He, and I don't know where he gets this data, but he insists that 99.9% of all of the species that ever existed on this planet are extinct now. And most of them became extinct not because of human activity, because we haven't been around that long. So we have to put all of this in context, I think. And then, therefore, if we look at it this way, the critical question becomes, how are we modifying the environment? You know, we as a species now, which has these incredible tools that we have invented for ourselves, and therefore have the capacity to modify the environment in ways, nature in ways that is unprecedented in the history of the planet. Are we doing that intelligently? What are the criteria that we're using? What are we trying to accomplish? And so when we ask the question, what's nature worth? There's sort of a simple answer to it, and it's how long do we want to continue to be around? Because there is no good reason to believe that the human species may not follow all of the other 99.9% of the species that became extinct before us. And so it really becomes vitally important and in our interest to do our part of the modifying of the environment, of modifying nature, in ways that, as Aldo Leopold reminded us, enable the capacity of the whole to renew itself. I mean, that's, you know, we can't preserve nature in its natural state, because nature's always changing. All of the organisms working with one another in the environment are constantly going to change it. And a million years from now, the environment's going to look very different from the way it looks now because of all of that activity. But the one thing we can do, as Leopold suggested, is that we can do our part in this community, in this biotic community, of doing it in a way that has the greatest potential for the whole system to retain the capacity to renew itself, because that's its resiliency, and that's our future. And so I think that's a little different way of thinking about it, and it becomes especially important when we think about things like agriculture, because it's so easy for us to quickly say, well, we're going to preserve the environment over here, and then, well, we got agriculture over here, and they're going to screw it up. But you know, if we keep a piece of it, you know, in its quote natural state, then we're going to be okay. And you know, this way of thinking about agriculture is very, very recent in this 3.5 billion year history. You know, it's like a nanosecond. And there's no good reason to believe that we're going to be able to retain the capacity of the whole to renew itself, approaching it that way. We have to start thinking about agriculture as a piece of nature, as a piece with nature. And how do we manage agriculture in such a way that it also creates habitat for the continual renewal and renewing, maintaining the capacity of the whole to renew itself, so that agriculture has to be seen much more as folded in and a piece of nature, rather than somehow a human activity that's separate from nature. It's not separate. Nothing is separate. It's all connected.
Don't start the timer yet. Unless you think that the prints over there are selfless and unabashed self-promotion, what I wanted to make clear was that the proceeds from it go to support, are going to be donated to the Center for Excellence in Arts and Humanities. So, anyway, first of all, the titles of all these pieces, except one, is Sacred Trust. That's been the titles of all my pieces for a decade. The exception is Satori, which is the one of the three claws, the pink one on the end. Just to give a little bit of context to those. But what I'm going to talk about is something entirely different. $20 bill. Okay, new $20 bill. Can't counterfeit these apparently. Stands for 1/19 of an ounce of gold as of last Friday on the spot market. That's 1.5 grams of gold. Or 1.5 grams at a density of 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter. That comes out to 0.08 cc's. Okay? Less than the thickness, a cube less than the thickness of this dime. I took the liberty of cutting apart another dime. Don't tell the Treasury Department. That's it. That's $20 in gold. It's actually not gold, it's silver and zinc, but lest you die for it. The value of nature, nature's worth. How much nature does $20 buy? Most commonly, when we apply a value to something, we mean to translate the value into a dollar figure. It seems to be a neutral and objective unit of measure with which we can compare worth. Insurance companies currently put the value in court cases of a human life at about $1 million. That's a lot of money. It can't buy a new loved one or bring them back to enjoy that $1 million with you. How many of us would be willing to trade our personally unique lives or those of a close companion for $1 million? Or a stranger, perhaps? That's rhetorical. How do we put a value on human life? If current events and a large part of human history serves as any guide, as a collaborative mob herd, we don't value it much unless it affects us directly. So, right now, as far as business and government are concerned, compensation for the loss of life is about 50,000 of these things, these pieces of paper, in court. How do we value non-human life? As a species, it's evident from the arguments made in the news, on talk shows, in editorials every day, that we don't care too much. We are, after all, humans, capital letters. The rest of creation is subservient to us. In our view, nature is for our use. It says so in the Bible, doesn't it, someplace? Something about our dominion over, et cetera, et cetera. Statements like, ew, a bug, squash it, gross. It's just an insect, kill it. Or worse yet, an absent-mindedly, matter-of-factly step on the life, which happens to be a bug, without even considering that you have extinguished a life form, sentient or not, who's to say? How does one justify respect for a tree which someone else sees merely as board feet? Rocks, water, air, etc. The only function of these is as matrix. We hold the things we consider, they hold the things we consider as precious. We discard them or use